12 minutes.
Sorry, we don't have our act together, but it's okay. It's pretty normal. Yeah, we're gonna give 10 minutes each so that
10
we
minutes
have
each.
time to discuss. And Brandon, I want you to get your metronome out and go back and forth.
And you have a phone, right?
And
With
when
a
it
stopwatch on it?
When
12 minutes
when
each.
somebody hits 10 minutes, I want you to start hollering at the top of your lungs, okay? No, I don't want to warn you. We want to get you guys.
Just, the word is cut.
Okay, cut.
You're the director.
Well, I should probably tell you before I begin that the history department does this from time to time, and this year's program was organized actually by my colleague over to my right here, Professor Thomas Lutze, who is going to be talking about some of his things on Chicago and different things that happened. But I'll let them tell you what they're going to talk about. I'm Mike Weis. I'm chair of the history department for one last semester. I will soon be the ex-chair and never again chair of the history department. But I'm chair of the history department. And here at Illinois Wesleyan, I teach courses in U.S. foreign relations, recent United States history, post-World War II, and also Latin American history. So hopefully some of you will get a chance to see me more regularly in a future semester. But since I don't know any of you regularly, it's kind of cool. What I've been telling my classes as we've been trying to get ready for this is that 1968 represented is and was the most important year in post-World War II history, not just U.S. history, but world history. In a lot of ways, it's a culmination of a lot of things. In a lot of ways, it's the beginning of a lot of things. And it has come to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So even though I know most of you weren't born until the 90s and the late 90s at that.
2000.
So some of you even 2000s. You're all shaped, whether you know it or not, by the events that happened in 1968. And so what I thought I would do is I will start us off by talking about some of the international dimensions. And some of you have had a lot of U.S. history either here or in high school and took AP and all that stuff. Probably remember 68 as a big year, and it was a year for assassinations. Both Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated in 1968. You probably also know that there was a major movement in the Vietnam War as we really began to realize suddenly in 1968 that we were in a war we could not win, and in fact had already lost. And that didn't really become apparent until 1968. But 1968 is also a really important year for political realignment. The parties that we know today and the whole blue-red divide and north-south divide and all that stuff really began taking shape in 1968, which somebody else will talk about, not me. So, but anyways, I wanted to welcome you to this, and I hope this turns out to be every bit as exciting as I think it's going to be. And I thought I'd frame this. So I just have to click once, and it goes to the next one. All right. No, I didn't do that. All right. When people talk about the 1960s frequently, they're talking about a time period, but a lot of people don't realize that in actuality there were two 1960s. There's the 1960s that's filled with hope and optimism and youth and experimentation, and we can do anything in the world. The whole world is up. We're going to put a man on the moon and all that stuff. Okay? There's that positive 60s. Okay? And that period really goes from about 1960 to about 1968. Then there's another 60s that sometimes most of you know a little bit about history focus on, and that's the rage. and the hatred and the riots and the assassinations and the wars and all that stuff. And what I'm trying to tell you is that these two 60s occurred simultaneously. Okay? There are two 60s, and until you understand the first 60s, the hope and optimism and dreams and things, then I don't think you can understand why all of a sudden in 1968 everything just sort of fell apart and we have all these riots and we have all these things happening, okay? Because without great hope and great love, there cannot be great disappointment. If you already expect everything to be crappy, then when something turns out crappy, you don't say, oh my God, you just say, well, yeah, I expected that, okay? And it's the fact that there was all this hope and there was all this optimism among people my age. We expected to change the world. We did not expect the world that we live in now to be a reality. But that makes some of that rage a little bit more easy to understand. So I wanted to start with that before I actually talked about any. What is this? Okay. All right. So, okay. I'll skip that part. So I got 10 minutes. What we do know is that in 1968, all over the world, not just in the United States, but also in the United States, but everywhere else in the world, we saw massive amounts of rebellion. Okay? This was true in the developing world, in Latin America. This was true in the developed world of the countries of Western Europe. This was true in the communist world. Okay? In all these places, there were massive protests. There is massive amount of upheaval. And in almost every case, these protests, these rebellions, these riots, almost to overthrow governments, were led by young people, people your age, okay? Not people my age, but by people your age who took the bull by the horns and decided now's the time to change the world, okay? And because there's so many different rebellions, there's a lot of different causes for those rebellions. And I'm not going to read those to you. I think you know how to read. You know how to read? You would think that. Right? You were in North Carolina hat. I thought for sure you probably could, but I wasn't 100% sure. All right. Give you something that's pretty good to look at first. Okay. I am going to mention one event that was on the previous slide. And that was that at the end of January in 1968, the NLF, the National Liberation Front of Vietnam, aligned with the government of North Vietnam, launched a series of attacks over the Lunar New Year, the Tet holiday, and it became known as the Tet Offensive. And they attacked more than 100 different places simultaneously. Okay, and a lot of those battles were really, really difficult battles. A lot of them were things in which we had to withdraw. Okay, very difficult. They were able to even go all the way down 100 miles south of Saigon. Every single county seat in the entire country was hit, and they were hit because about 3 or 4 weeks before Tet, General Westmoreland, who was leading the American forces in Vietnam, announced that he saw a light at the end of the tunnel, that we were going to win this war, and we would be safely winning and bringing the boys home by Christmas of next year, which was just conveniently right around the time of the next presidential election. So keep voting for Lyndon Johnson, and we're going to have victory.
Kept you out of work first.
And yeah, and then all of a sudden, Tet happened, and it was massive, and it was a humiliating battle. And there is all this history that says, oh, we didn't really lose in Tet, but the thing is, most Americans woke up after Tet, and they realized we were in a lost cause. We were losing a war that we assumed we were going to win very easily, because after all, they're back in the Stone Age and we're in modern 20th century. We're so arrogant and cocky that we just assume that we couldn't lose a war like that. And all of a sudden, it just suddenly dawned on most Americans in January '68 that, holy shit, we have lost this war and we can't do anything about that. Okay? And that's going to cause the death, well, not the death, but it's going to cause the elimination of the American president. Lyndon Johnson only lasts about a month after Tet before he announces to the world, I'm done, I'm going to negotiate peace, and I'm not going to run for president anymore. Well, that has international dimensions too, because for a lot of young people, remember all the hope, they believed in John F. Kennedy. They believed that. They believed they wanted to put a man on the moon. They believed in American values. They believed we should be a country that supports democracy all over the world, and we should be a country that supports human rights all over the world. And what they saw was we were coming up short in so many ways, and they were mad. And they had their hopes dashed. And they decided that they were going to do something about that. They were going to play that out, and they were going to force the governments to listen to them. Okay? And so there are protests pretty much throughout the entire world the rest of 1968. Okay? I'm just going to show you a few pictures because I don't want to go over my time here. What? No. I had to do all this, okay? One of the most famous things is Prague. Starting in 1968, people in Prague decided, students in Prague decided that they didn't like their system and they wanted to change, and they forced in a reformer, a guy by the name of Dubček, who decided that, yes, we are going to have good universities, we're going to put money in infrastructure, we're going to have more freedom within the Soviet world. And that lasted for about 6 months until August of 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded. And here's the first sign is right when this started and everybody's rejoicing. And then when the Soviets came back and invaded and crushed the rebellion, that was just a week before the Chicago National Convention. And all of a sudden, and this is just huge. The most important of the international events occurs in Paris in 1968, in May. Okay, the students took to the streets in part to protest the Vietnam War. Okay, they didn't think that America should be in Vietnam, and they were protesting that, but it quickly spread to women's rights and women's equalities issues. And what I loved about the Paris rebellions is that women were the major leaders of the Paris rebellions. Okay, unlike in all the rest of the countries, women were the ones that took the horns and took to the streets, and they brought down, or close to brought down, the government of Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle actually lasted for one more year. In '69, he was forced out of office. But these rebellions throughout the month of May in 1968 virtually destroyed de Gaulle's government. Just 1 month after Paris, protests started in Rio de Janeiro because cops, and I know this is unusual, it never happens here, but cops killed an African-American teenager for no reason. And people went berserk. They basically was like, there's no reason for this police brutality. And they took to the streets, and millions of people took to the streets to fight this oppression. And the government responded by not only arresting thousands of people and killing dozens of people, but they arrested by overthrowing their own military dictatorship and instituting a more severe military dictatorship, because one set of generals said the first set of generals was just being too easy on the young kids and stuff, okay? The other thing that prompted was that a congressman said this dictatorship in Brazil would be over if wives would just stop sleeping with their husbands. And I guess the generals didn't like that too much either. But the biggest of the massacres took place in October. In 1968, Mexico won the bid to win the Summer Olympics. And because it's Mexico City, they held the Summer Olympics in October where the weather's better. And students were protesting. Why are you spending millions and millions of dollars on stadiums and on, housing for athletes when poor people don't have enough to eat? And when we don't have good schools, and we should be spending that money instead of on stadiums, we should be spending that money on books and things like that. And the protests went on through the summer months of 1968. And then one night when, it was pretty normal that they had 10,000, 20,000 people all coming at once while they were meeting at a square at the local. The police completely surrounded the demonstrators. They didn't let anybody out, and they opened fire and just started mass murder. More than 100 people died. More than 10,000 people were arrested. Very chilling effect. The Olympics opened up 1 week later, and those Olympics are highlighted by the fact that 2 American athletes, after winning, I think, the 100-yard dash, decided when they received their medals to put up Black Power salutes. And they lost their medals. They were sent home, and for just basically utilizing their American right to protest. Okay. So I just want to let you know, this is an international thing. It's not an American event. It's an international event, and I took too much time, so I'm going to give this thing to my colleague April Schultz. I know, I wasn't getting mine to work either. I just did 4 2-hour talks last week.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the United States. Professor Lutze is going to talk in part, among other things, about the National Democratic Convention in Chicago in August of 1968. And actually the event I'm going to focus on mostly, well, one event happened in January of 1968, but the big event I'm going to talk about happened on September 7th. 1968, after the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and this will be important to know as we get there. You all, well, I'm not going to assume you all know, but the movement for women's rights, what we think of as the second wave feminist movement, really began some could argue it began in the 1920s. Some argue it began sort of in subtle ways in the 1950s, but officially it began really with the organization of the National Organization of Women, that was created in 1963. But what we think of as radical feminism or the women's liberation movement in the United States really comes into national focus in 1968. And I'm going to take about 4 minutes to show you a clip from a fairly recent documentary. And I want you to hear the voices of the women who were there as they talk about it. This was made 2 years ago. And there's lots of great video and photographic footage in this clip. So, cross your fingers. If it doesn't work, I'll just tell you what it says.
Do you activate?
No, I won't act it out. Okay, it's not showing up here. It's on my screen. It's hiding. Ah,
to the struggle, where they were inspired by the example of their black sisters.
My first employment in the civil rights movement had me working for a black woman. She was not only the first black woman I'd ever had as boss, she was the first woman I'd ever had as a boss. It was the beginning of my own emancipation.
Radicalized by their experiences in civil rights, these younger women began to look at their own lives differently.
We were talking about freedom and equality, and some of the women who were in the civil rights movement started applying principles to themselves as women.
Women could not fail but make the comparison with race and understand that just as there needed to be a racial liberation movement, there needed to be a women's liberation movement. Whenever one person stands up and says, wait a minute, this is wrong, it helps other people to do the same.
The civil rights and anti-war movements not only inspired younger women, but also exposed them to deep sexism, even within their own ranks.
My experience in those movements was suddenly one of discovering that I was a natural leader, and yet men were not letting me and other women rise as natural leaders.
A woman and her man would come home from demonstrations exhausted from being beat up by cops or being busted or whatever, and he would lie down on the sofa and wipe the tear gas out of his eyes and say, wow, it was really hard. And she'd say, yeah, and wipe the tear gas out of her eyes and go and make dinner. The bad behavior by guys in the left was particularly heartbreaking to us, because we were young, idealistic women thinking we were making the revolution together. Out of that context, the first autonomous, radical feminist groups began to form.
It was a campus meeting of Students for a Democratic Society, and I was talking before the group, and one of the guys in the group said, shut up. And I finished speaking, and then went around the room and tapped all the women on the shoulder, who were probably over 50% of the people there, and said, let's leave and go upstairs and talk on our own. These women were angry, and they were organized from having been in other movements. They were disciplined, and they knew how to create a movement. They had done it. They had done it with men. Now they could do it for themselves.
All over America, pretty much spontaneously almost, in college communities and big cities, these groups would develop. And what came out of it was similar problems, similar ways of being treated by the world, and often similar desires.
These young women had a much more sweeping vision of change than their sisters in now. They called it women's liberation.
It was heady and exciting and naive, imagining that if we just explained it to people, that was so unjust that surely it would change.
Marriage is, as I've said, is unpaid labor. I mean, no woman is a free household slave for each man.
Society itself would have to take major collective responsibility for the care and the rearing of children.
Every man oppresses women. I mean, they have the chance to oppress the women they marry.
Meeting in small groups, women began to discuss their private experiences for the first time. They called it consciousness raising.
Consciousness raising was the thing. That is how we learned about our lives. That is how we learned that we were not alone in what was happening to us.
These first small groups began to compare notes, and whenever an oppressed people compare notes, it's just bloody dynamite, you know, because first of all, it's the you too moment.
What we discovered was we all had fathers who browbeat our mothers. We all went out for jobs and only found that we could look in the women jobs wanted column. We all faked orgasms.
Did I ever fake an orgasm? Oh, you bet I faked an orgasm. Oh, oh, oh.
You gotta understand, our minds were being blown. Everything was wide open, and it was a very scary, fertile, exciting, exhilarating time.
The new ideas of women's liberation, born in consciousness-raising groups, jumped from campus to campus and city to city.
It spread very, very fast. I can't believe how fast it spread. So many radical ideas could be passed on. For example, there would be a conference at Berkeley, and all these pamphlets about
One of these groups, as I said, these groups spread very, very quickly around the United States. And one of the most prominent groups in 1967 organized in New York City, and they were called New York Radical Women. In the fall of 1967, a small group of women began meeting regularly in cramped apartments on the Lower East Side. And these were all activist women, some coming out of the civil rights movement, as you saw at the beginning of the little clip I just showed, and some from the anti-war movement and the Students for Democratic Society. Some were what was known at the time as politicos, and that meant these were women who believed that if we could bring about the downfall of capitalism, patriarchy would disappear. Other women, radical feminists, said, no. Right? You have to get rid of both at the same time, that they're both contradictions, and you have to focus on both equally. The New York radical women disintegrated within a few years. They spread out and became parts of other groups. But they played an outsized role in helping to define the burgeoning women's liberation movement and pioneered crucial elements of modern feminism, including the earliest and most provocative critiques of the family, marriage, love, normative heterosexuality, and rape. They fought for safe legal contraception and to repeal all abortion laws. They fought for the creation of high-quality community child care centers. And they fought for the end of the media objectification of women. They, along with other radical feminist groups, or what was called at the time cells, developed consciousness raising as the movement's most effective organizing tool. And they coined the terms, the New York group coined the terms that we know today: sisterhood is powerful and the personal is political, among others. This small group of young women also wrote formative essays that they published in mimeographed, before Xeroxing, documents or pamphlets that they handed out that became the foundation of the major literature in women's studies. By 1970, radical feminism was on the verge of becoming a mass movement, in great part due to this small group of women in New York City. They also practiced a flamboyant brand of political theater that helped bring national attention to the concerns of both radical feminists and also feminists in general. They announced their existence on the national stage on January 1st, 1968, when they joined an anti-Vietnam War march led by what was called the Jeanette Rankin Brigade. This was a large group of mostly liberal feminist women and anti-war protesters they named themselves after the first woman elected to Congress in 1919. And their goal was to strike for peace and to encourage congressmen who were coming back for the session in January to oppose the Vietnam War. Now, the New York group argued that this was futile, that they wanted to join the larger march, but as a sort of protest within a protest, to say that you should not organize an anti-war march based on your identity as a woman or as a mother or as a traditional woman. We're against war because we are innately more nurturing. And they said, no, that's not what you need to do. You need to organize based on the policies of the military-industrial complex and the sexism that's inherent in the patriarchy. Oh, so what they did was, I told you they were flamboyant, sort of theater, and this was their first major action. So they joined the march. There were about 500 of them. They joined the march, they delivered a speech, but then they created a funeral procession. They came along with this big sort of bier with a fake body on the top, a woman, sort of Barbie doll type woman, and hanging off of the bier was disposable items like curlers, garters, hairspray, streamers floated off of it, and banners. They carried banners that said, "Don't cry, resist," things like that. Sisterhood is powerful. One woman wrote a long funeral dirge lamenting traditional woman's role. And they handed out black bordered invitations to the 5,000 women marching there, inviting them to a funeral that night at Arlington Cemetery where they would bury traditional womanhood, quote, "who passed with a sigh to her great reward this year of the Lord 1968 after 3,000 years of bolstering the egos of war makers and aiding the cause of war." Okay? So that was their first action. And then they decided to start planning another one. And they decided, for various reasons, to go after the Miss America pageant in 1968 in September. One of the leaders in the New York group thought that disrupting the beauty contest just might be the way, she said, to bring the fledgling women's liberation movement into the public arena. In their press release, they called on all women to protest the image of Miss America, an image that oppresses women in every area in which it purports to represent us. The protest would feature a freedom trash can in which women would throw away what they said were manifestations of women's oppression: bras, girdles, curlers, wigs, magazines like Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal. One protester brought her 15-year-old son's Playboy and ripped it up and threw it in the trash can. Male reporters would not be allowed to interview protesters. And the reason for this is what they wanted female reporters to get the bylines, because the few female reporters that existed were always relegated to the style pages. And if they wouldn't grant interviews to the male reporters wouldn't have the stories. So they needed the stories, and it would be women reporters. They argued that there were many reasons to protest. One was the degrading image. Two was racism. There had never been a Black or Native American or Hispanic contestant to the beauty pageant. And the military-industrial complex, because they said Miss America played the role of a death mascot when she entertained the troops in Vietnam. So they tried to relate all of the major issues of the day in this protest. They obtained a permit from police, and they engaged in guerrilla theater, and they had incredibly provocative signs. Just look at a few of them. "Welcome to the Miss America cattle auction," "Break the dull steak habit." Okay, I'm just going to show you a few of these signs. They also encouraged boycotts of all the products that either represented women's oppression or products that sponsored the pageant. Here, a more important struggle is going on in America than who wins tonight at the pageant. The struggle for women's liberation, Black liberation, and Vietnamese liberation. Okay, so again, making the connection between the other movements. Can makeup cover the wounds of our oppression? Miss America pageant, racism with roses. Women showed up from all over the country, actually. They took buses in to Atlantic City to protest. I am a woman, not a toy, pet, or mascot. Yeah, they brought a sheep in and crowned the sheep Miss America there. And now the famous freedom trash can. How many of you have heard the term bra burner in relation to sort of women's lib, right? The bra burner. Okay, this was a myth. Very interesting myth that came out of this. What happened was they actually did plan to have a trash can that they would light on fire and all of these objects would be thrown into it. Before this, it was in the anti-war movement, you would see Vietnam vets against the war throw their draft cards into a trash can and fire, and so that was being done as kind of protest. And what happened was the police permit, they couldn't have a fire because it was a wood boardwalk. They didn't want to have a fire start. But a female reporter from the New York Post saw their press release and thought, oh, this is really interesting. And she interviewed one of the organizers who described what they were going to do, and this reporter thought, oh, this is really cool. Draft dodger, bra burner, that's really cool. And so she made up this phrase, burning bras, and they were going to be bra burners. Well, there weren't any bras that were burnt at the protest, but other reporters took that pre-article and turned it into quote unquote the truth. And it spread like wildfire, so to speak, around the country in newspapers that women had actually burned a bra. And Art Buchwald, who was one of the most famous columnists of the time, wrote, "The final and most tragic part of the protest took place when several of the women publicly burned their brassieres. If the average American female gave up all her beauty projects, she would look like Tiny Tim, and there would be no reason for the American male to have anything to do with her at all." And in case you don't know Tiny Tim, where did I put Tiny Tim? There's the article. That's Tiny Tim. You don't remember, you're all too, most of you are too young to know Tiny Tim. So with that, this bra-burning, hairy-legged, radical feminist became the kind of totemic symbol of those who opposed feminism at the time, and this kind of myth was born. During the actual pageant, that night, the women, many of the protesters, they disguised themselves. They wore high heels and fancy dresses, and they got tickets, and they went into the pageant. And just as the old Miss America was reading her farewell speech, they flung a banner, Women's Liberation, over the balcony and yelled protest, and so it got on national television. Primetime national television. So they got all kinds of publicity for this. At the same time, the next day, just down the block, was another kind of protest. And it was the first Miss Black America pageant that was organized by an African-American entrepreneur whose daughters asked him, why don't we ever see any women who look like us at the pageant? So he organized this pageant. And in the New York Times, we had, along with Miss America, there's now Miss Black America, happened at the very same time. So the protest at the Miss America pageant, because of the guerrilla theater, because of the national attention, radical feminism really kind of goes mainstream in 1968. On the cover of Time magazine, this is one of the women who were involved in this very small group in New York City at the time. Okay? So, I think I've done more than 10 minutes. Okay.
I'm going to give a little introduction to mine. As you can tell from the presentation so far, 1968 was marked by a year of images. And so what I decided to do with my presentation here is actually include a whole lot of really short film clips. And they are going to tell most of the story. But my topic is dealing with the anti-war movement and the student movements. And as I was looking at that, just as Professor Schultz indicated, there was a convergence, or what we might call today intersectionality, that existed among the various movements of this time period, the anti-war movement, the civil rights and the black liberation struggles. These all were coming together, the women's movement, all learning from each other, all active in support in one way or another of each other. So you're going to see that, and I found that I was unable to really deal with what was going on with the anti-war movement without also dealing at the same time with some of what was going on with black people's struggles in the United States. So, let's see what I can make this work. Okay, so as Professor Weis indicated, this is a very, very short clip.
Student-led rebellions broke out in Paris, Berlin, London, and Mexico City. Just before the riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, Russian tanks rolled into Prague and crushed Czechoslovakia's brief flirtation with democracy.
Okay. And as Professor Weis also indicated, the Tet Offensive was a defining moment. I want to just show a little bit of footage of how American people began to see the results of this offensive that Professor Weis had explained. Let me just show you some of the news footage from that time.
The year was barely a month old when the North Vietnamese launched an audacious attack on major cities in South Vietnam. The battle, known as the Tet Offensive, even penetrated the grounds of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
Now CIA men and MPs have gone into the embassy and are trying to get the snipers out by themselves.
The pictures on the television of street fighting in and around the U.S. Embassy, the idea that the military was calling for another 200,000 people on top of 500,000. The sense that we were in this for a good long while, it certainly did suggest that there was not light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay. So as, again, to demonstrate just how sharp a turn in American public opinion was caused by the Tet Offensive, a question had been asked in a poll, is the U.S. making progress toward victory? And before Tet, 50% said yes. Now that indicates that already the anti-war sentiment was pretty strong in the United States, but to see that just about 6 or 8 weeks later, it had dropped to 33% indicates a massive change in American public opinion. So it was in that context then that the anti-war movement continued to grow.
Meanwhile, the anti-war movement was exploding. College campuses across the country erupted in protest.
It was common currency among my fellow students that the President of the United States was not telling us the truth about Vietnam.
Okay. And this, as I indicated, was a year of images, and certainly television played a huge role as people sat in their living rooms in the evening, watched the evening news with Walter Cronkite, who was the most respected news broadcaster in the United States at that time, and saw these kinds of images.
Lost any men here? Well, I've got six people I've had wounded. Yeah, you gotta be an idiot not to work.
'68 was the bloodiest year in the Vietnam War. 16,500 U.S. servicemen died, almost twice as many as the previous year.
And even though we did not have news coming to us about how many hundreds of thousands and then ultimately millions of Vietnamese were killed in this war, this kind of footage of the bodies being brought home, the flag-draped caskets that we saw, all had a huge, huge impact. Now, what was going on in the anti-war protests was accompanied at the same time with the development of protests by black students in the United States. And these were going on all over the country again. But I wanted to just highlight here a little bit of what was going on, what the thoughts were at this particular time period. As the Civil Rights Act had been passed in 1964, and yet many, many blacks did not feel that there had been any true freedom brought about by the passage of that act. And so there was an emphasis, undoubtedly influenced by the Vietnamese people's struggle themselves, to pursue black liberation, not simply civil rights.
We are tired of being beaten, we are tired of being murdered, we are tired of being shot down.
2 years before this, there had been a very powerful speech that had been made by a young black militant whose name was Stokely Carmichael, who was with an organization then called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he had called in that speech for black power. And as we get into 1968, it was a slogan now that was spreading very, very rapidly.
Cleveland Sellers was a civil rights veteran who'd been schooled in Dr. King's nonviolence. But by 1968, like many young activists, Sellers was becoming more militant. The old freedom songs gave way to a defiant chant, "Black Power."
And again, as Professor Weis pointed out, this found its way to the Olympics in Mexico City.
And during the Mexico City Olympics, 2 American medal winners, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, shocked the nation when they gave Black Power salutes during the national anthem.
One of the more troubling features of the movements of the late 1960s was the deaths on campuses of college students who were protesting. Probably the most famous of these was the killing of 4 students at Kent State University the following year. But there had been other episodes of police violence against demonstrators, and one of the most important, certainly one of the first during this period of the 1960s, came to be known as the Orangeburg Massacre in Orangeburg, South Carolina.
I think it was 8 seconds, but it sounded like it was about 24 years. I mean, it was just loud, just boom, bam, bop. And so the inclination was to drop down to the ground when I was going down. I felt my body twist as I got shot in the left shoulder.
When the smoke cleared, there were 3 dead and 27 wounded. The incident would become known as the Orangeburg Massacre, and it marked a new and deadly phase for student protest.
Shortly after those events that took place, that Martin Luther King, who had been the charismatic leader of the civil rights movement, and who himself, significantly, just 1 year earlier, had made a major speech in New York City, stating his own opposition to the war in Vietnam. And it was in early April that he went to Memphis to support some sanitation workers that had gone on strike. And he gave a speech that had this rather telling snippet as part of its message.
Everybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place.
It was just before 6 o'clock on April 4th, 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King stepped outside his second-floor room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis to chat with friends in the parking lot below.
NBC interrupts its regular program schedule to bring you the following special report.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
The response to the killing of Martin Luther King was widespread, and there was an irony that was involved because, as one of the speakers is going to point out here, Martin Luther King had always called for nonviolent protest, but there were so many people who felt that nonviolence and the betrayal of Martin Luther King's efforts in his assassination called for an outrage. I personally happen to know a university professor who was in Chicago when this news broke, and he, as an art professor, he went out in the streets himself and picked up a brick and threw it through a window, simply because of the same sense of outrage that was so widespread at this moment.
Parts of the capital city were already on fire.
It was deep-seated anger.
You had troops coming in and around the White House.
Here we have Dr. King, who is talking about peaceful change, and he's assassinated. And that was just anger.
Riots went on for days and days.
The eruption of violence and arson that followed Dr. King's assassination would engulf black neighborhoods in more than 100 cities.
All of this created a backdrop for the Democratic convention that was held in Chicago in August of 1968. Again, as outlined previously, we know that in March, Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States, announced that he would not seek re-election. And a lot of this had to do with the growing outrage and anger at him for his continued efforts to carry the war forward in Vietnam. And in fact, during this time period, Lyndon Johnson became even more obstinate and stubborn about wanting to pursue the war. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was put in a position where he had to toe the line with LBJ. But in opposition to this war effort by Lyndon Johnson, Eugene McCarthy, who was from Minnesota, ran for president, and he came very, very close to winning the New Hampshire primary. And then he went on and he won the Oregon primary. At about that time, Bobby Kennedy joined the race, and the two of them went head-to-head in California, and Bobby Kennedy edged out McCarthy. And so it looked like maybe Bobby Kennedy was going to be the one who would be pushing forward, except for the fact that on the night of his acceptance speech, he was slain in the hotel.
Kennedy's body was taken to New York and then put on a funeral train for Washington, D.C. Jeff Greenfield was on board.
Every time you looked out the window and saw Cub Scouts with an American flag saluting, or World War II vets, or maybe older, with their caps saluting goodbye, or people in tears along the train, I can only speak for myself, that's when I lost it. Inside the train was one thing, but when you looked out, you understood what had taken place.
So the Democratic convention was going to be a divided convention. It was going to be Lyndon Johnson with Mayor Daley of Chicago backing him up, and Hubert Humphrey against Eugene McCarthy and the so-called Peace Force. The key convention vote was what to do about Vietnam. Were they going to support the ongoing war, or were they going to take a stance
On the minority report, the names are 1,041 and
The peace forces were handed a crushing defeat.
The minority report is not agreed to.
The convention had voted to support the war. Humphrey's nomination was a foregone conclusion.
Singing the anthem of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome."
To drown them out, party managers directed the band to strike up another tune.
Happy days are here again.
Democrats could no longer listen to each other.
Inside the convention hall, tensions were high as security forces loyal to Chicago Mayor Daley tangled with reporters and delegates alike.
What are you trying to strong on stuff? He's an elected delegate.
Any sense of decorum was lost.
The Chicago police are now in the aisles here with billy clubs clearing people out.
When news that delegates had rejected an anti-war platform reached the protesters outside, their anger reached a fever pitch. Despite violent clashes between police and protesters earlier in the week, McCarthy aide Sam Brown was hopeful that cooler heads could prevail.
The police are not going to attack a bunch of people sitting in the middle of the street in downtown Chicago. The television cameras are up there. The whole world is watching, for Pete's sake.
It's right in front of the Hilton Hotel, Michigan and Belleville.
From the east side to the west side of the park, where the demonstrators were, this phalanx of tear gas-laden vehicles goes marching through the park.
The so-called daily dosers, these jeeps with barbed wire mesh on the front of them to push people back.
Spewing tear gas ahead of it, blinding these kids who panic.
Police attacks, windows breaking, tear gas every place.
These were the scenes that so many of us saw on television.
I went down, trying to fend off some of the blows. I came back up, in which case they hit me again. They hit me again. This has been at least a dozen of them.
The 18 minutes of violence was recorded by television cameras, and the unedited footage was broadcast around the world.
What I'm going to do because of time is I'm going to move forward a little bit here and simply mention here that ultimately it was Hubert Humphrey that did get the nomination.
I say to America,
his acceptance speech.
Put aside recrimination and dissension. Turn away from violence and hatred.
But the damage had been done. The Democratic Party self-destructed on national television, and Hubert Humphrey left the convention a hobbled candidate.
1968 was a watershed where the Democratic Party that had formed under Roosevelt and sustained itself under Truman and Kennedy just became unstuck for good. That coalition, that particular coalition, was gone, and we're not going to see that one back.
Okay, I have some thoughts about changes that have taken place as a result of these events, but I'm going to hold off on that and turn it over to Bob for right now. But maybe we can talk about that a little bit in the question and answer.
This is a web-page where I need to get to my IWU.
Get Chroma.
Give it bar, listen, I have something that I need to watch.
all seen this before. Well, you haven't seen these videos. I heard Tom was going to do all this, so that's of course Bobby Kennedy. This is the protest, the labor protest, the labor strike that Martin Luther King was at. This, of course, is, as I've told students in one of my classes, this is a Bruce Monk in Vietnam put himself on fire in protest. This is women marching, Malcolm X on the right, and Martin Luther King on the left. Here's Bobby Kennedy with Cesar Chavez, who hasn't come up yet. And Cesar Chavez united the farm workers in California. He was on a 25-day hunger strike, and Bobby Kennedy went there and broke bread with him the day that he ate it. I'm going to talk to you about this. This is the guy named McCarthy, a different one. No, this isn't McCarthy. This is the spoiler from the South, Alabama, the governor of Alabama. And I'm going to show you some electoral maps, and I am going to do what Professor Weis talked about. These are earlier things in this course, but I loaded all this stuff for today, which is basically just a bunch of maps. Don't worry, it's not the kind of maps you think. Those of you in History 152, this is what you're supposed to read for tomorrow, right here on the little page. I was going to give you a handout.
Election maps?
No. Yeah, I know. This, this is George Wallace in 1964. I know it's about 1968. 1968 runs for president again. He was governor of Alabama a number of times. His wife was governor of Alabama one time. It's kind of like Putin, putting somebody in his place, until he could come back. But this speech, if you go through here, this is about a piece of legislation that was passed in 1964 called the Civil Rights Act. Following that in 1965, and it was followed with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And Johnson, of course, got behind it, and said the voting rights was needed because southern states were again putting roadblocks up in front of people, African Americans, to vote. But what I wanted to show you about this is there's all kinds of people talking about freedom and liberty in these years, and so was George Wallace. George Wallace was talking about freedom and liberty, and the way he was talking about freedom and liberty was in relation to something we know now today as states' rights. And I'm going to go back and show you some maps and show you the Electoral College and where there's a political realignment. I've mentioned this to my students. We're just now talking about it. We are in the 1960s now. But if you just look at some of this language in here. Today, this tyranny is imposed by the central government, which claims the right to rule over our lives, under sanction of the omnipotent black-robed despots who sit on the bench of the United States Supreme Court. This bill is fraudulent in intent, design, and execution. It's misnamed. Each and every provision is mistitled. It was rammed through Congress. All this stuff. It had widespread support. It is things we hear in our political culture today. Fraud, sham, hoax going on in Florida right now, right? Fraud, sham, hoax. The President of the United States is using these same words to explain the elections that we're having right now. These are not new things. Donald Trump didn't come up with them. You wanted me to talk about Donald Trump, so I'm bringing him up. Donald Trump did not bring these things up himself. And I have a 30-minute video of him giving his speech when he becomes governor in 1963. There's a Confederate flag draped over the podium, and the language in some of these protests by neo-Nazi groups that happened in Charlottesville, North Carolina, for example, anti-Semitic slurs and blood land and these kinds of things. They're not new, and they hark back to an earlier time. And the question, right, the historical question is what, you know, in these years, Mike mentioned it, there's a political realignment. Let's see if I can get my cursor up here.
Close the speech.
This is one of those.
Showing that we used a map.
It's not opening, it's downloading it. I need to open it myself, right? Why this brown area in here? Well, you see here, there's Nixon, the Republican, Humphrey the Democrat, and Wallace is the American Independent Party. What Wallace wanted to do in 1968 is force a contingent election. And what that means in American politics is what how Jefferson got elected the first time way back in 1800. And if neither party gets a majority electoral college votes, it goes to the House of Representatives. And what Wallace wanted to do, he knew he wouldn't win, but what he wanted to do was he wanted to have this contingent election and then have to be able to use his power, use his votes, and use his influence to get them to dismantle the civil rights legislation that was passed in 1964 and 1965. So the man is not stupid, and he's got goals and objectives he's trying to implement. He would have liked to be president, but he wasn't. And the thing is, then, is, you know, as you learned in this election, and in your lifetime, I think you're relative to my colleagues here who lived through some of this stuff, you're relatively short-lived. I think we've had at least 2 or maybe 3. I'd have to go back and think about it, and I don't have the time. Elections that have not been contingent elections, but have been electoral college elections, right? The last one, 2000, and I believe the second Bush one, if not the first. But the thing is in order to win the presidency, you've got to build a coalition that's going to win the electoral college, regardless of whether you're able to win the popular vote, because Trump lost by 3 million votes, right? So how do you do that? Well, let me go back and just show you a few maps. And Brandon might stand over my shoulder because I have trouble with this archaic PC here. This is where the survey course starts. And I can get you all the way to the present, one easy sweep. All these blue states are Democrats. They're the ones, remember, that do not want blacks to have voting rights and equal rights. They're the ones who fought for the Confederacy, right? It's the Republican Party and the group of radical Republicans who, when we start the survey course, the electoral vote is contested. And so what they do is they form a committee of 5 congressmen, 5 Supreme Court justices, 5 senators, right? And they end up voting. There's 8 Republicans on the bench, and there's 8 Republicans, on the committee, and 7 Democrats. And guess what the result is? It's 8-7 for the Republicans. Just like the Supreme Court in 2000 was 1 vote. It was a 5-4 on the Supreme Court, and Sandra Day O'Connor cast that last vote for basically George Bush to be president, so she elected him. But this is blue. At the same time, you see that here are these southern states, right? Florida, we're still, but South Carolina, Louisiana, and they're Republican. Why are they Republican? It's because African Americans voted. They voted. They elected people to Congress, right? Not long after the Civil War, 12 years after the Civil War, or whatever. And what's going to happen in these states then is they make this deal that we learned at the beginning of the semester in that course. And basically the bottom line is there's military districts there. There's power there. There's a federal power guaranteeing people's right to vote. right? And you take that power out, and then the power goes back to the states. And when the states have the power, they deny people the right to vote. So when people are talking about states' rights, that's what they want to do. They want to deny people the right to vote so that they can maintain power in the state. And that's and the kind of words that you saw in that 1964 speech that Governor Wallace gave. What he's doing is this is tyranny. This is exactly what they were saying here. This is tyranny. This is tyranny. What do they say? Tyranny. And throughout, it's liberty. We want liberty, and this is tyrannical government. And of course, in these years when he's governor and beyond, they equate it with the Soviet Union. They say these people are communists or radicals. In that speech that I have up there, he's calling Hubert Humphrey a radical communist, for supporting the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965. Hubert Humphrey purged the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in 1948 when he became senator. He purged the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota. He purged the more radical farmer and labor groups out of that so they could form the Democratic Farmer Labor Party and then say we don't have any communist influence or radical influence in the party. So you keep your eye on the colors as they shift here. Here's quickly in 1880. The compromise is made. It's all Democrat. Remember, get today's Democrat out of your mind. Okay? They're voting for the people who want the states' rights, right? They're voting for the people who want these states' rights. So we get up to, we're going to get up to 1968 here, and 64. You see, these are Republican. And this is a guy named Barry Goldwater. And this is where Ronald Reagan gets to start. Ronald Reagan loves a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Ronald Reagan is a Democrat up until 1962. Am I out of time? No, I have a couple more minutes. Are you nodding because I'm not kidding? So Barry Goldwater is extreme. He says extremism in defense of liberty. The South goes for him as a Republican at that point. In 1968, Wallace runs.
At the bottom to the right. Bottom right. Bottom, way at the bottom. There you go.
It's also here. Wallace runs and he wins these states. Nixon develops a Southern strategy, but it's not just in 1968. He's going back and he's looking. And even as Nixon was vice president for Eisenhower, Eisenhower was looking to get votes. Although he couldn't take the South, he was looking to get votes in the border states to the South, those not the solid South, down here. And Nixon had some experience doing that. But he also goes and he makes some deals with Strom Thurmond in South Carolina. And the bottom line then is, in order to get with the shifting populations and the Democratic Party was divided, and the Democratic Party becomes a party that supports civil rights and voting rights, and the Republicans then have to develop a strategy in order to put together a coalition. And there is this huge block of voters. And in order to vote, you've got to have a base. And the cornerstone of the Republican Party becomes this part of the South in order to vote on, to get those electoral votes. But at the same time, George Wallace in 1960 is going to Milwaukee, he's going to Boston, and he's giving speeches about busing, and it's resonating with blue-collar workers who are on the defensive, and they start to say they want to vote for Wallace. And there's all kinds of things culturally going on here. I could show you things, but my time's up, I take it, and that does get us up to Trump, and I was going to show you a short 1-minute clip of what happened in North Carolina, but hopefully you've seen it on the news, and we know it for questions if you want to field some questions from students. Now Brandon, clip it off.
Well, I want to thank everybody for their presentations here. as I indicated early on, 1968 was a very full year, and there's an awful lot to say about it, and there's an awful lot that we didn't say, believe it or not. But we would certainly like to field any questions that you folks might have. If there was anything that came up in any of these presentations that triggers a question for you, we'd be really, really happy to try our best to answer it. So, anybody? Yeah.
Do you have any distinct memories living in 1968?
Oh, yeah.
Any of these issues broke out? Any thoughts on them?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I guess I'm the oldest of the four of us, right? So, yeah, I was a junior in high school at the time, and there are a number of things. My father marched with Martin Luther King on a couple of occasions, and his death was a very, very heavy moment. And one of the responses to the Civil Rights Movement and the fact that the Civil Rights Act had not yet fully made a change for equality for black people was that there was radicalism that developed among many, many young black people in particular. And it was at this time that, in '68, that a young man named Fred Hampton joined the Black Panther Party in Chicago, and he became a leader of the Illinois chapter. And it would be 1 year later that Fred Hampton was assassinated in his bed in Chicago. But he had come to where I lived. I lived in Valparaiso, Indiana at the time, and he and a number of Panthers had come out to Valpo, kind of with a challenge to white people to ask, are you really supportive of what we're trying to do? Trying to defend our neighborhoods, to stop police brutality. And so he actually gave us these little pins for what was the initial, what was called Rainbow Coalition. And Rainbow Coalition in Chicago at that time was a coalition of Hispanic, known as the Young Lords, and then there was the Black Panther Party. There was a white organization of Appalachians. It was known as the Young Patriots. These organizations had come together. There was also a Native American community in Chicago that was involved in this, and they had taken buttons from the Nixon campaign, actually, and they had painted over them. And they had this different, all the different colors representing different racial groups. And they said if you wear that and you go onto the west side of Chicago, you will be respected. And so a couple of buddies and I went into Chicago, and we went down West Madison Avenue. The Panther office was in the 2500 block, and we got off there. A very dangerous, normally a dangerous area, but we did, get recognition for this, and we spent some time trying to actually rebuild their headquarters after it had been burned down during the police attack. So lots and lots of things. Be happy to talk with you more.
Let me, if you're in my class, when you do leave, we'll entertain questions for a bit longer. But if you do have to leave, when you do leave, send me an email right away. Let me know you'll be off the phone from your phone at this time of the day. Right? There's some people who left before it was over, and they're not going to be able to send me an email just right now.
Any other questions? Sure.
I wonder if you could address the question of as to why, with the kinds of issues facing the country today, the number of murders of African Americans, the fires and climate change issues, they're so abundant, the rise of anti-Semitism, numerous other things. Why you think in a time when so much easier to communicate, we are not seeing activism on college campuses?
Ask the students.
That would be great.
Well, one answer to that is, we might disagree on this, but definitely students have a stake. One of the draft cards,
Right.
the movie that Emilio Estevez makes about about that day when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Daniel Radcliffe plays this guy who's getting married. That's somehow going to keep him out of the draft. So when you have skin in the game, it's definitely going to make a difference and cause you to get out and say and realize, well, why am I going here? If I'm going to be drafted.
Also, baby boomer population.
Yeah, I really think that Bob is hitting on something very, very significant there, and that is that because of the military draft, the war in Vietnam was very, very real to all of us, very real. And even, male or female, if you were male, you had a chance of going. If you were female, it was your brother, your boyfriend, your husband. That was something that was one of the lessons. I didn't bring up the slide. Brendan's going to try to pull it up here. Now, go back one more slide. Not only did people in the United States learn some things from this, but the government also learned some things. What we realized is that experiences from these movements broke the widespread notion that the U.S. is always on the side of freedom. As a little boy growing up in the 1950s, that's what we were told, and we really thought that there was a free world, and the communists were tyranny. And these issues, and as we began to explore what was going on in Vietnam, and we learned about this series of dictators that the United States had supported, it kind of blew that out of the water for us. The demonstrations also showed that protests could affect policy. But the last two here, the government learned that open media coverage of war can turn public opinion against the conflict. And there has been very tight control of the media in the Gulf Wars, the Iraq War. There has not been the kind of footage that's been available to the American people. And then, as Bob pointed out there, the government learned that the military draft made war a sharp reality for American youth. And everybody paid attention. Right now, there's war going on in Afghanistan, and I doubt if anybody in this room gives it a second thought, unless you have a brother or somebody who's over there, or a sister, or most people don't give it a second thought because it's over there and it's not going to impact you. But during this time period, it was over there, but it's very real to us. Very real.
I was going to say something. I also think there are students, active students on campuses, maybe more now than recently, not in those kinds of numbers. But I think that one of the issues too is you say that we have more social media and information, but I actually think we're more fragmented now than we were then. When you had only 3 networks, television, and you remember, you and I were both really little in 1968, but I remember very vividly, we saw this stuff on the TV every night, and every family did, and they saw the same stuff. They saw the protests, and they saw the war coverage, and I think that helped. In fact, historians do argue that had a tremendous impact on both the civil rights coverage in the 50s, before you and I were born, and then the stuff in the 60s really brought people in. And now there's so much. It's like information overload. What do you grab onto? What's true? What's not true? And so in a way, it makes it.
Well,
it's more serious, but it's
what they're referring to as echo chambers. Because we get on these feeds, and then you end up getting some of the same stuff over and over again. And it's like Johnson said about Walter Cronkite. He said, when I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the American people.
I would also like to dissent a little bit. I think in the last 2 years, I think there has been more activism among college students than there has been in the previous 40 years before that. So, I know I didn't get to college until the 70s, and things were already pretty well dead by that time. And I never left college, for a couple of years. I actually had a real job, but there's more activism now among college kids than there has been since the late 60s.
Yeah, early 80s there was a lot.
I worked very, very closely in the Central America stuff. And Central America,
nuclear weapons.
You could get 100 people to attend something. You couldn't working to
We've got a number of students.
better.
Yeah, students want to.
Yeah.
You know, in Oakland in 2017, there's 1 million people in that city.
We got 2 students. Mike.
Yeah.
You're a student first.
Yeah, why don't you go first?
Well, what I was going to say is I think that part of it, as messed up as this is, I think that a lot of our generation is really focused on other people's perception of themselves with social media and stuff. And I feel like a lot of people are scared to stand up for what they believe in because there's the potential ostracism by other people in the same kind of age group.
If you're not liked on Facebook, you're not liked in life, huh?
Yeah.
Well, there's also tracking too.
Yeah.
It stays with you for a while.
And so I think that has a lot to do with it, that kind of hyper awareness of other people's perceptions of you and like what's the right thing to believe in or what's like too much, which I think is like super messed up, obviously, but I think that plays into it.
Interesting.
I think also the commercialization of activism, and because I mean, like something we talk a lot about in Pride is rainbow capitalism, where it's like if you have enough sort of Pride gear, then you're set, like you're a cool ally. But then there's not like that next step taken where you're like attending marches and meetings and like sort of doing the more structural work. Also, I think the fact that so much of our livelihood is tied to our occupation. I mean, not necessarily as students, but like our future occupation. That is a really scary prospect because I know, for example, my family is a big State Farm family, and I don't plan on working there. But there's this fear for the people who still do that like there's going to be some sort of employment backlash if they speak out about the American Legislative Exchange Council, or if they speak out about some of the conservative policies that State Farm has been supporting. So I think it's like
You need to work in another town, Amanda. You're not able to work in
Why is
Bloomington,
that
Vermont.
different?
What?
I was gonna say, you're not going to be able to work in Bloomington, Vermont.
There's the word you see.
Yeah, you can work there.
Why is that different than earlier? Is that different?
Well, how would you know, how would an employer know that you, unless you had an arrest record, right?
She points at me.
Yeah, because I think I think the different ways, yeah, the employers are able to access that.
So what I was saying about tracking.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Laura?
Plus, with like all the social media, it's easier to do easy activism, like be like, oh, I support Black Lives Matter. I changed my Facebook profile filter, or I signed this petition online, or I shared this article. Where really like the kind of activism that really incites change is like on the streets and stuff. And when you do the easy stuff, you're like, oh, I'm an ally, I did this, and you don't feel the need to go farther.
Just kind of going off of that, I think that there's a lot of assumption that like other people will do it. You know, that like I'm an ally, I did these things, like I was gonna bring that up too, like the profile thing, it's like knowing that you stand for that cause, but I feel like there's a lot of personal interest in our generation, and so a lot of people are like, there are other people that are doing the real activism, and I totally support them, but I have these other things to worry about. So.
If you're going to be drafted in 2 months, you might change your mind. Yeah, to go back to Tom's point.
Well, yeah.
Like the stakes are kind of different.
The thing is that there are a lot of factors in there. I mean, one thing we didn't even talk about today is culture. And there was a rejection of our parents' culture. I mean, Mike talked about at the beginning was that this was a youth-driven movement around the world. And we rejected the music of our parents. We rejected the rules about the way we had to dress. The fact that you guys get to wear blue jeans all over the place is really due to what we did to break dress codes in our schools. There was such a line, between our generations that we were going against that it kind of swept up the whole society. And yet today, I think that there's a difference in terms of, can you draw a line between your parents' generation? I mean, I remember when my son was playing some music and I walked into his room and I started singing along with it. And he said, "How do you know Led Zeppelin?" Well, yeah, you know. So, you know, and I did not do that with my dad. When he was playing Frank Sinatra,
Right.
I did not go in there and start, you know, or
Andy Williams.
Right, or, yeah, Harry Como. You know, those were, it was a different thing. So, in a way, I don't want to leave some kind of a message here that it's impossible to mobilize and it's impossible to do things. There have been major mobilizations that have taken place. You know, even, you know, the Women's March in Washington was a biggie.
Yeah, but that's exactly it. We've had these marches and they're one-time events.
I mean, I was at the Women's March in Chicago with every woman in my family, and we're going again this year, and like, that's just becoming a continuous thing. And like, even you mentioned these like silly little Facebook posts you make, it's like raising awareness. A lot of people are like, if you don't live in Chicago, you don't see the violence that happens every day.
When you
and
also,
you're like, oh yeah, like people died on the news, but like when you see it, it's very different. And just like raising awareness makes a big difference too. And it seems silly and frivolous to like post on Facebook an article like people died. Like just raising awareness is big too.
When you have people, what's hopeful to me, more hopeful to me is that since 2016, you have so many people just in our own county who have become involved in a way that they never were before. I mean, running for office, walking and knocking on people's doors, and that people who never did before, never, and who are doing in droves, and that's hopeful, and it's different than these major, you know, the kinds of, you know, like at the Democratic Convention or the, you know, some of the bigger.
But, you know, the thing about that I just, if I may comment on that, is that a lot of young people actually did get clean for Gene. And they did that kind of stuff. You know, they went door to door, knocking on doors, trying to get people to vote.
They're registering voters.
Right. And they did a lot of that kind of stuff. And when the doors got slammed in their faces, or they saw a convention that was manipulated in spite of what, that's when things began to get more radical, when people began to question, you know, is this system something that really works for us? And as that began to spread, then you had, you know, this new level that developed. So.
I'd like to make one comment about one thing, Ted, because it does set it up that, okay, here's the 60s and we left and we created this, but, and you agree with me on this, I'm sure, there are these seeds there. And there are people, Eugene McCarthy doesn't come out of nowhere, and Jonathan Weiner, who's a New Left scholar, and he wrote this essay in the Journal of American History, and then the journal added back in '89 or '90, and it was all about all the accomplishments of the New Left. And the best response in the roundtable was Herbert Aptheker, who was a radical from the Depression. He said, "This is great, John, and we applaud everything you did." He said, "But do you not want to say that we did this in the Depression? Do you not want to talk about the Popular Front? Do you not want to talk about what he got through running around with that guitar, Pete Seeger? Do you not want to?" And people were influenced by those things. And there were people who, maybe not in their political campaigns in the 50s and stuff, but there were some people who might have been, you know, like McCarthy, who were influenced.
Oh,
and it's there. You get the beats, you get the bring stuff, and whether it's art or music, you know, rock and roll. My students today were looking at, you know, the early 50s rock and roll. It comes out of jazz and Harlem Renaissance. All this stuff is showing the diversity of American society we have now, and we applaud now. But now it is isolated more in all these echo chambers. You know, you get on Facebook and be just a jazz group, right? And as somebody, if you're just in there all the time, are you ever going to see something new coming?
Anything else? Well, on behalf of the panel here, I want to thank all of you for coming and for staying so long. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your input, your questions, and I'm sure if you have any other questions that you want to put to us, we'll be very happy to answer them. So thank you all very much for coming.